Hello and welcome. I am Miss Patel, and I teach at Montgomery Blair High School in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is just outside of DC. I'm here today to talk to you about topic 3.2, cultural landscapes, which is a pretty important topic that goes across many different units. So, we will learn more about the different characteristics that make up a cultural landscape. First thing we need to learn is the definition of cultural landscape. So cultural landscapes are made up of a lot of different elements, including cultural, economic, and natural elements. And it's all these things that are on this landscape. So they consist of a lot of different specific things, like all of the things listed on the screen, but we want to go more into each of these. So let's break these down further. So first, we have all the physical features. So this is kind of like the backdrop for all the stuff that goes on top of it. These are all the natural features like vegetation and mountains and climate. For example, if you looked at a picture and saw snow versus palm trees, you know you're in a different place in the world. So you always want to think about where you might be. You also have the agricultural and industrial practices, which is more of the economic things that are on the landscape, which consists of potentially a certain crop that you might see being made for agriculture, or maybe a certain factory. You also can get a hint as to how developed a place is. If you see people wearing suits, leaving a skyscraper, for example, you know that place is more developed. So those are more economic. You also have the cultural things on the landscape, such as religious and linguistic things. If you were in real life, you might hear a person speaking a certain language. In a picture, you might see a language on a sign. And you're also going to see a lot of religious elements, such as something someone's wearing, or a religious symbol, or a place of worship. A more difficult term that's included is sequent occupancy. So sequent occupancy is the fact that you can see a lot of different groups of people on one piece of land, because each group that's come there has left their mark. So I'll give you an example in a little bit with a picture. Architecture is a pretty important one that frequently comes up, because architecture tells us a lot of things. There's traditional and modern architecture, but a lot of different types of architecture can tell you a lot about where you are in the world, can also link you to religion or a certain government, can even display power, right? The last thing that's probably the most important out of any of these is how the land is used. So the reason we care about cultural landscapes is by looking at what people care about on the land tells us a lot about their culture. If they're devoting a lot of land to industry versus agriculture, that might be more important to them. Or if there's a big canal, it shows that that canal is very important to them, potentially for transportation, or they live near it, or something like that. So all these things together make up the cultural landscape. We care about this because geographers are constantly studying differences all over the world. So cultural landscapes allow us to compare cultures and the landscape across regions. And a lot of what we're going to be doing with a lot of the photo analysis in this video and the next video are practicing figuring out different regional elements. So let's look at some examples of what I mean. There's going to be a lot of pictures, so if you ever want to pause the video to look at it longer, you can. So for example, in this photo, I want you to see if you see any cultural, natural, economic, any elements you see in this photo. So remember, you can pause it, but if it was me doing this analysis, I would mention that I see a lot of people taking up the street. I don't really see any cars. There might be one in the back, but for the most part, it's taken up by people, and this is clearly a market. So there's some kind of economic system going on here. I also see a lot of people wearing jeans. A lot of the males are wearing jeans, and a lot of the females seem to be wearing more traditional clothes. And if you look at the signs, you see different languages. So I think this is Hindi in one sign, and there's English in another sign. So all those things together are making up the cultural landscape. And this is actually a picture that's in India. So that all makes sense. It's because those are all elements of that culture. Let's do another one where we focus on the land use. So land use here is devoted mainly to this giant canal, right? Where clearly this canal is used for both transportation, and it looks like there's houses going right up next to it. this traditional boat in the very front of the picture is probably something recognizable to some of you. This is a gondola, and it's how people move around in Venice. So we're in Venice, and a lot of these different elements make up a very unique looking cultural landscape that we can recognize as Venice. Let's do an example of sequent occupancy. So this is a picture that I took while I was traveling in Rome, and it's a great example of this because if you look in the front of the photo, there's a lot of ruins, and these are Roman ruins that are all that behind it all have more modern buildings, including this building that has this black statue on top, which was built by the first king of Italy. So to honor the first king. So it wasn't built until 1911, whereas a lot of the Roman ruins are from centuries ago. So this is a great example of sequent occupancy. And right behind this area is the Colosseum, which is also an example of sequent occupancy because you can see traditional mixed with modern. All these cars on the street going right around this very ancient Colosseum. Let's take a second and look at this photo. If you look at this and I asked you where it was in the world, you could probably give me at least a continent. So you should be able to guess that this is somewhere in Europe because this is quintessential European architecture. So this is a small town in France, and those cobblestone streets and the small little row homes and the shutters all kind of should remind you of French architecture. So this shows you how architecture can very quickly tell you what region you're in. Let's do one more. So this is a great example of industry and economy at work. So in this picture, we can see a lot of different elements, right? We can see highways, we can see a port, and a lot of container ships and skyscrapers. So that should tell you this is a pretty developed place that clearly has a lot of industry. This is in Hong Kong, and this makes total sense because it's on the water, and you see all these different elements of a pretty big port that's in the world. Let's practice with a multiple choice question, because an important thing to know here is that you're never going to see the exact same definition. You've got to be able to reword cultural landscape. So go ahead and pause your video to give yourself a second to read this multiple choice question. So it says cultural landscape can be defined as, and it's basically looking for a definition. But like I just said, you're not going to see that same definition that your brain might be looking for. So the best answer here is C, because this is another way of wording it. All cultural landscape is the forms that the humans have made on top of the natural environment. So the forms that are superimposed on that physical environment. So C is a great answer here. So what should we take away from all of this? Make sure you know the definition of cultural landscape and be able to reword that definition. So knowing it's the combination of cultural, natural, and economic elements that make up that landscape. And more importantly, that it's really just the human impact that we can see on that physical landscape that's visible and can be compared across regions. So a couple key points that will frequently come up throughout the course. Land use is very important. Land use shows us what a group of people thinks is important and what potentially what their economic system is. It shows us a lot about what's going on in a place. Being able to recognize differences between regions, which we're going to practice more in the next video, is also very important. By telling the difference between Islamic architecture versus traditional European architecture, for example, you could tell it's a different region. You also want to be able to point out economic and cultural features such as language. For economic, you might see a port or some kind of economic system in place. But more importantly than all of this is why do we even care? Which is the one question you should frequently go back to. This all helps us to study the activities that humans do and be able to compare them between regions to figure out spatial connections, which is constantly what human geography is looking at. And learning about other cultures allows us to expand our knowledge of the world and hopefully be able to preserve all of those cultures. So in the next video, you will practice a lot of sourcing back. I'm Ms. Patel, here to continue teaching you about topic 3.2, cultural landscapes. So today we're going to go more into the skill behind cultural landscapes, which is photo analysis. So source analysis is one of the big skills that you need to know in AP Human Geography, and being able to look at a photo and analyze different elements of the cultural landscape is very important. So we have a lot of animation tools we can use to look at this and a lot of photos that we can do. Remember to remind yourselves of the important elements that we're looking for. We're looking at cultural, economic, natural elements, as well as even political, anything that is showing us about how the culture and the landscape intertwine in the photo. So a couple things to remember with source analysis. We don't just want to analyze the source and pinpoint the elements. We really want to think about the spatial patterns that are shown. Remember that spatial just means where things are in the world and why they're there. So we're going to constantly go back to where are we and why is it there and why do we even care? So why is that the spatial pattern you see is always what you should go back to. And more importantly, what can we conclude from those spatial patterns? So we're comparing this across regions, across different scales, and trying to figure out why we even care about what we're looking at. So let's look at some examples. Remember that you can always pause the video to look at a photo longer because there's going to be a lot of photos and we want to explain a lot of different things about them. So pause it if you would like to look at it longer. So go ahead and look at this photo. This photo is very interesting because you have the juxtaposition of the traditional sail and the traditional boat in front of a pretty developed looking city and a mountain. So you want to put together these elements you see. So the cultural elements here are, this looks like it is some kind of Asian boat mixed with skyscrapers in the back. So you're looking for a place that's probably pretty developed near the water in Asia. So this would be Hong Kong. And this is just going to give you an idea of how to start looking at these photos. And then we'll start analyzing more. On this one, we want to focus on the agriculture that is present. So you want to look at both the landscape. So by the landscape in the right photo, you should be able to tell that this is rice farming, which has the quintessential terraces for producing rice. And in the left photo, you see the rice farmers with the traditional hats mixed with some of the palm trees. You could probably be able to guess that this is in Southeast Asia, and we might know that because it's a huge rice farming area in the world, right? So if we take that one step further and say, why do we care? We can see that rice is in a lot of Asian cultures, and that's also partly because they're making it a lot there. All right, for this one, we're going to use this cool magnifying glass. So if we focus on the person in this photo, which is a common thing you want to focus on, what are the people wearing? It looks like this is probably a monk, the way that he's dressed, so we should be able to associate this photo with Buddhism. And if we think about where Buddhism is in the world, probably China or somewhere in Southeast Asia is where we can zone in, combined with some of this Asian architecture, and it's hard to tell, but those are elephants in the back, then we actually can pinpoint this as Thailand. This is a Buddhist temple in Thailand. All right, let's use this cool magnifying glass for another one. So these next photos are a great example of how religion can frequently show up in architecture. So I zoomed in on the top of that symbol on top of the dome. This is a photo I took of Taj Mahal while I was in India, because the little symbol on the top is actually a crescent moon. So you should be able to associate that with Islam. And this architectural style, which is also displayed in the next two photos, is very, very common in Islamic architecture. So the Taj Mahal and this mosque, which is right next to it, were actually built by the Mughal, during the Mughal Empire. So that explains some of the Islamic architecture. As well as this fort in a surrounding city. This fort is called Amber Fort, and this is where some of the generals lived during the Mughal Empire. So same kind of thing with the doorways and the domes. This is a very quintessential Islamic architecture. So that helps us to place us in the world. This next one is a great example of sequin occupants. So if we look at the architecture and some of the elements, like the hanging garland, we should be able to place ourselves in Mexico. So there's a lot of Spanish influence here in the architecture. So you see that influence of Spanish people coming to Mexico, as well as some of the more traditional Mexican celebratory garland that's in front. So those two things together show us a lot about those two groups of people and how they affected the land. All right, now we should be pros at this, so let's see what you can do. Remember, you can always pause your video to look at it longer. So in this photo, you should be able to pinpoint a lot of different things. You should be able to notice the Hindu temples in the background. It's very common Hindu temple shape. And there's also these giant steps. These are actually called ghats that go right up to the water. So clearly land use here is interesting because there's people on these steps, there's people in the boats. So this river seems very important to them. So this is a Indian town that's on the Ganges River, which is a pretty big river and one of the starts of civilization in the world, actually. So that makes sense that this would be an important river. This one's interesting because it's way more developed. So if we focus on what kinds of language we see here, what other cultural elements, you should hopefully be able to see that this is Japanese on the signs. And if you notice Godzilla in the back, that would help you place this in Japan. Another thing to point out here is how many people are there. Oftentimes, if you see a crowded place, you can at least associate it with a populated country or city. And another thing to notice is the land use. They clearly care about pedestrian walking areas since that whole area looks like it has a crosswalk on it. This one is a very important one to know. So this is important because it's combining agriculture with some very unique cultural elements here. This windmill and canal are just extremely unique to the Netherlands. This is very, very common in the Netherlands, and they actually serve purposes to help make the water level not be too high for all of the agriculture around it, because Netherlands makes a lot of fresh flowers. So a combination of seeing the specific good with the windmill and canal system should be able to tell you you're in Netherlands. One more example of sequin occupants. So these are Roman ruins right in front of these more modern townhomes in Spain. So this is a great example of Roman ruins outside of Italy, where you're seeing the evidence that both of these groups have been on this land and making this new cultural landscape. Just a couple more. So this one is in Vietnam, and the key here is to see how much they're using this water. They're using this whole canal for a seeming agricultural market. There's a lot of people. This is actually a traditional boat market. So they're actually selling their goods from these boats onto all over this canal. And this is very common in that country. All right, this is really cool. We're going to use a very cool animation thing here. Sometimes it helps to try to focus on either the foreground or the background. So in this one, I want you to focus on just the signs, right? So you should be able to see that this is Vietnamese, right? Combined with, if you add in just the front, you can see this juxtaposition of the more traditional with her hat and her fruit cart right next to the more modern vehicle. So that helps us kind of place us too, because there's going to be places in the world where there is a combination of these two things, and we can tell a little bit more about economic development from that. So what's important to take away here? For sure, that skill is extremely important. You need to be able to look at a photo and analyze different cultural, economic, and natural elements and explain why it's important. So part of why it's important is being able to figure out those spatial patterns of how people move and compare different regions around the world. It requires understanding all the different things that make up a cultural landscape, but really you're just pinpointing. It takes practice to get used to all the different elements that might show up. So a lot of geographers do this when they're looking at in real life or at a photo to be able to analyze different human activities all over the world. So in the next video, we will be doing more photo analysis, teach you more about topic 3.2, cultural landscapes. In this video, we're going to focus more on how we can use cultural landscapes to see attitudes about ethnicity and gender. So remind yourselves what cultural landscapes are, but we want to focus on the part that they can reflect how there's how people feel about different cultural beliefs and identities. So things such as the role of women in the workplace, ethnic neighborhoods, and indigenous communities and lands, all that together help shape use of space in a given society. One other important term before we get started is gendered spaces. So there's a lot of different private and public spaces that are often reserved for a specific gender depending on your culture. It helps to use an example. So for example, in the United States, a very common one is locker rooms, where men and women are divided between the two private locker room spaces. Another example that I have from my own life is when I went to a Hindu funeral with my husband's family. After the funeral, they cremate the body, so they start walking the body over to a crematory. Traditionally, this would be on a fire, and I, of course, started following his family. But one of his female cousins grabbed my arm and told me women aren't allowed to follow over to the cremation area because traditionally they were considered too weak to watch that. So that's clearly an example of gendered space. Another common thing we might see is certain economic roles devoted to certain genders, such as teaching and nursing being considered a woman's job, or the traditional phrase of women belong in the kitchen. So I want you to focus on those things as we go through these photos. So let's look at a bunch of examples. Remember, you can always pause the video because there will be more photos if you would like to look at it more. So how does what you see in this image potentially tell you about the role of women in this place? You should be able to notice that you don't see many women. So that could mean that it's more reserved, an area reserved more for men, such as some kind of economic market where it's mainly men doing that job. It might mean that the women are stuck at home, and it might mean neither of those things. The important thing to remember is you can't tell exactly what it's like to be a certain gender or ethnicity in a culture from a photo or even in real life. It just gives us some idea. So what about here? You can clearly see that these are indigenous women. This is a group of women in the Andes Mountains who are weaving, and they're dyeing they're getting the yarn from the sheep, they're dyeing the yarn, they're weaving. So it clearly looks like that's a reserved job for women in this community. Another key thing to note is that the women are wearing traditional clothes. This is something you're going to see throughout all of these photos, that oftentimes the women are wearing traditional clothes and the men are wearing more modern clothes like jeans. That might give you insight into that area or that place potentially being a patriarchal society. What about this one? How do landscape features or land use in this photo reflect cultural identities? So this is a traditional Navajo hogan, which is a traditional space they would live in. And by them building their home from the land, it clearly shows you they value the land and they want to maintain the land. That tells you a lot about that indigenous community in that area just from this photo. What does this photo show about gender roles or identities in India? From my time visiting India, I know that these bowls are traditionally used to carry goods from the market or spices. And it looks like it's mainly women buying these bowls and selling the bowls. So that must mean that's probably a woman's job in this place. You also see women wearing traditional clothes and and taking care of the babies, which is another common thing you see. So it seemed like those might be considered more women's roles, at least in this place in India. Same thing here. It looks like it's the women's job to carry water to the village, and again, they're wearing the traditional clothing. And the same thing here. It looks like it's mainly women, and they are harvesting the rice in traditional clothes again. So let's go back to this photo we looked at in the first video from 3.2. Do you see anything in this photo that might tell you anything about gender elements, gender roles? So a key thing to note here is, again, what I just explained, that a lot of the males are wearing jeans and more modern clothes compared to a lot of the women are wearing more traditional clothes. When I was in India, another key thing to note is that it depends on where you are. If you're in a city like New Delhi, you're going to see women wearing more modern clothes. If you're in more rural areas or smaller towns, you'll see women wearing more traditional clothes. So it depends on the scale and the economic development of that area. Here's another one that I took of women in Ecuador. So they're wearing the traditional clothes. It's hard to tell in this photo, but the men would often wear sweatpants or jeans. So let's switch to how we can use cultural landscapes to look at ethnic neighborhoods. So how does this photo show an ethnic neighborhood? This is a photo that's taken in Miami, but it looks like it could have been taken in Cuba, because this is actually in Little Havana. And you see this sign in Spanish, and you see these traditional Cuban food and drinks that are available to be sold at this place. So this shows that this group of people, Cubans specifically, live in this area. Here's another one that's in San Francisco. So if we think about why there would be such a huge Chinese population in San Francisco, it kind of starts to explain why geographers even care about this, right? They like to look at where the spatial layout of different ethnic groups. So there's a large Chinese ethnic group in San Francisco because of the gold rush and because geographically it's closer to China and because of building the railroads. So a lot of this is just to explain why things are the way they are and why care. Let's look at one more indigenous group example. So there's an area in Canada, this light blue area on the map called Nunavut. And this area is very interesting because the Canadian government recently in 1999 gave this area more autonomy, and that was due to the large Inuit population there. So how does this shape space in the society? This has actually been able to grow the Inuit population. They feel honored and protected by their government. They've been able to do school in their traditional language of Inuktitut, and they've been able to feel like they have a place. Versus, if you compare this to the United States, where a lot of the American Indians have been pushed further and further west in history and continue to fight for their lands with the Dakota pipeline protests. So that shows you a lot about how different groups might be treated in different places, depending on the government and society. So, what's important to take away? Cultural landscapes can help us see all kinds of attitudes about ethnicity and gender, and across different regional contexts. You can see things like the role of women in that place, ethnic neighborhoods, or indigenous communities. And all of those help explain how space is in a society and what's devoted to different spaces in society. But the thing to remember too is like the photo is not everything. You cannot tell every single thing about a culture, a gender, an ethnicity from a photo. So it's important to remember that photos do have limitations for looking at these things. Remember to go out